Hello, my name is Mary Harris, and this is the roaring year of 1920. Very important events that have impacted today's society in the 1920s is first and foremost the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance was a time for African Americans that came alive in Manhattan's Harlem. This area was designated for blacks and they were not restricted because they had their own club. And the ability to create music and not be judged or even thought that you would be killed for coming to a club or look at someone the wrong way was very important for the birth of African American culture. Another important thing in this time period were politics. Hitler had just given his first speech in the year of 1920 following the end of World War One. So Hitler was on the rise of power. This affects our everyday community because 6 million Jews were killed, and you don't know what could have happened as far as the art culture shifting if those 6 million people were here today. Lastly, we're going to touch on today the civil rights. The civil rights for women, the 18th Amendment, which allowed them to start to vote, as well as the Prohibition and the uprising of the KKK in the year of the 1920s. 400 African American people were killed by the KKK with lynching, and nothing was done about it. So on the list, we have the radio. The radio was created by Lee first, and it is described as Sound Factory. This had publications such as KDKA in Pittsburgh and WWJ in Detroit. The radio is so important for artists today is because it had created a sonic connection between the people, and the more connected people became, the more barriers begin to fall. Television is also a very important factor because television connects people visually, as well as today we have our cell phones. So you have some of the early inventors have built the iPhone today on top of their inventions. So without things like the television, we wouldn't be able to stare at our screen and access whatever we desire. This influences the art today because we look and we see more digital art being created directly impacted by the television. Second or third, we have the Ford assembly line. This is important because this has enabled companies to create more reliable every genre. So by adding to the television and the radio, we were able to communicate further and even build new languages with things like the Ford assembly line that was created in 1920. Just to go over a few characters that had a bit of controversy, Amos and Andy is an American television sitcom set in Harlem, but it was two white men depicting African Americans in a poor light. It just to show you the kind of culture that was going on in the 1920s. Really important world events was in February, of course, Hitler came to power of February 24th. May 2nd, the first Negro Basketball League was started. Baseball league, excuse me. And this was important because now African Americans had more pastime to do what they liked to do and also had that protection of being around one another. There was also the end of the pandemic after 30 billion people had died from the Spanish flu, and that was the last pandemic since before today. And lastly, the prohibition was really important. The prohibition had created such atmospheres with gangsters and different type of behaviors because now that it was illegal to sell alcohol, we now see things pop up like Atlantic City and furthering into Las Vegas, and this creation of the mob had really taken over because they now had something illegal to sell. The Harlem Renaissance was a very important part of our history here in America, and we do not talk about it often, but it has created the Cotton Club again, and which was created by American boxer Jack Johnson. Another very important person that was born and active in the 1920s is Paul R. Williams. He was an African American architect, and many people don't know, but he created the Beverly Hills sign, as well as engineered the pool, and he wasn't even able to swim in the pool at that time period. Another person came out of the Harlem Renaissance who influences us today, which had broke the chains off of many African American people's minds and has given us the sense of writing that we see today in our community, is Langston Hughes, which defied just writing about the typical normal white person in order to sell books, but he brought culture alive in the 1920s to our people that of color. Another really famous person that came out of the 1920s is Duke Ellington. He was one of the most famous composers of the time, as well as today. He's won over 9 Grammys. So as you can see, all of these things, the radio, the television, the music, influenced the art of the 1920s. Servants and masters, or the pet of a master. Thank you so much for watching my presentation on the 1920s and how different things affected our art today.